I am Dr. Dion Nelson, a naturopathic physician practicing in Portland, Oregon. I invite medical professionals to listen as I delve into how shifting the focus off of weight in healthcare can greatly improve health outcomes for patients of all sizes. I will explore what it means to practice in a weight-inclusive paradigm and discuss tools to implement these ideas in practice. Keep in mind that the information I will present may be new to many of my listeners and may sound radical to some, but stick with me, this information could change the lives of your patients. This episode includes an amazing interview that I had with Nicola Rinaldi about hypothalamic amenorrhea, which we will be referring to as HA in the podcast because it is a bear to say. There were a few times that Nicola's sound petered out. I tried to fix what I could, but I did want to mention that after she talks about her IVF experiences, she mentions that she did get pregnant on a natural cycle. I wasn't able to fix that part and I had to cut it. And so I just didn't think that the discussion would make as much sense without that knowledge. The rest of them, you can mostly understand what she means, even though it's hard to hear. And then I had to cut a few of the other things, but they made sense without them. Also, we discuss calorie numbers at about 12 minutes in, 14 minutes in, and about 41 minutes in. I decided to leave them in, again, because they were salient to the conversation. Dr. Nicola Rinaldi has a PhD in biology from MIT. Since experiencing hypothalamic amenorrhea herself, Dr. Rinaldi has been on a mission to spread awareness of the condition and how to recover. In 2016, she published the book No Period, Now What?, updated in March of 2019 to be more health at every size aligned. This book is a comprehensive resource that includes much of the medical and scientific research that underlies our current understanding of the triggers of amenorrhea, what steps to take for recovery, and treatments to use for recovery and pregnancy as needed. In addition, Dr. Rinaldi performed the largest survey to date of women who likewise experienced amenorrhea and includes results from the survey answering many of the common questions women have, such as, how long will it take to recover? Will I be able to get pregnant? And will I resume cycling after pregnancy? Finally, the book includes Dr. Rinaldi's own story along with those of hundreds of other women, providing hope and reassurance to women following in their footsteps. Since publishing No Period, Now What?, Dr. Rinaldi has been on a mission to spread awareness about hypothalamic amenorrhea and recovery, appearing as a guest on dozens of podcasts, attending and presenting at industry conferences, as well as continuing to participate in ongoing academic research studies. She now also works with clients on period recovery and getting pregnant. Now, on to the interview. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you today, Nicola.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your having me. I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to chat with you and your audience and, hopefully bust some of the myths around HA and PCOS and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Awesome. So I guess we'll start with a little overview of who you are and you just, kind of tell us how you got into this and a little bit about your story, because it's always really good to know who we're talking to, right?
Absolutely. So I did a PhD in computational biology at MIT in the early 2000s. I wanted at the time to go into the biotechnology industry, and I was really interested by sort of the genome-wide data that was coming out at that time. So, I learned a bunch of statistics and programming and obviously how to read and analyze research papers. And so then I did go and work for a biotech company for quite a number of years after that, Biogen IDEC. So the HA thing kind of ended up being completely separate. So at the end of my graduate career is when I actually experienced HA myself. So I decided to cut my calories because a bunch of the guys in my lab were, going on a diet and losing weight. And I was like, oh yeah, I've got some weight to lose. And, I was starting to think about getting pregnant and reading a lot of places lose weight to have an easier time getting pregnant, lose weight to have a healthy pregnancy.
Right.
So, I was like, oh, this is a win-win. I get, I'm going to have an easier time getting pregnant, and, I'm going to, have a six-pack, I'm going to look great, this is awesome. So I cut my calories significantly, and I lost a bunch of weight, and then I went off the pill to try and get pregnant, and my body was like, yeah, no, don't think so. So I was kind of in the dark at the time because there was very little information in sort of the, public sphere about amenorrhea or hypothalamic amenorrhea. I Googled it, and there was really nothing that came up. So I didn't really know what was going on. And I saw my doctor, and she, we talked a little bit about my eating and exercise habits. And she said, well, maybe you could eat a little bit more, and maybe you could exercise a little bit less, and, come back and see me in 3 months if you still don't have a period. So I did that. I ate a little bit more, and I exercised a little bit less, and I still didn't get a period. So my journey kind of goes on from there. I ended up having one period, and then I was already seeing fertility doctors. So I went through a bunch of fertility treatments because the doctor said to me, oh, it's probably just a one-off, and, nothing's going to happen. So my whole journey took about 18 months. I did eventually, after 4 failed injectable cycles, get pregnant. So then that kind of encompasses my personal story. And then actually, while I was pregnant, I ended up finding a message board of women who were likewise experiencing HA, and I kind of jumped on because I was put on bed rest, and so it was a good way to keep myself occupied.
Right.
And so I ended up sort of walking those women through what I had done and learning, I just learned so much about the mindset around HA and the control and all of the different factors. And when people would ask questions, I would go back to the scientific literature and research and read the papers. And so I learned an amazing amount. And eventually, after a few years, a lot of the women on the board said to me, you know so much, you should write a book. And I was like, yeah, I should. Because, I never envisioned myself as an author. It was not in my life plan at all, but I had something to say, and I really felt like there was just so little information out there about HA at the time and what causes are and how to recover. And I felt like there was a lot of misinformation being shared to these women by their physicians. And so I hoped to just educate people and share the research that I had done and the experience I had with all of these women, helping them to recover. And so that's sort of where the book came from, and how I got to be doing what I'm doing.
That's fantastic. I'm sad that you had to go through all that, but I'm really glad that all of this came out of it, because it's amazing. And a lot of people are learning a lot and getting a lot out of it. So thank you. We appreciate it. I think probably next I would want to, just for the edification of our listeners who don't know a lot about HA, I know not everybody is a practitioner, or maybe some practitioners who just haven't run into it a lot. Just kind of an overview of HA and let us know, what it is and kind of, well, sort of the causes, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So the underlying cause of HA, it's hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is basically a missing period because your hypothalamus is suppressed or shut down. Your hypothalamus is an organ in your brain that controls a large part of what our bodies do. It sends out all sorts of hormones, and it takes in all sorts of hormonal input as well. So it's the organ that sends out the signals that tell us we're hungry, that we're full. It might be involved in some certain cravings. Like if it feels like it needs some protein, it might send out, like that, our cravings come from our brain. And it controls how much energy is expended on different components. So it controls how warm we keep ourselves. So it's taking in hormones, also taking in hormones from our digestive system. It has receptors for cortisol. It has receptors for glucose and insulin and other hormones involved in the eating process. So it really is, and then of course it controls our reproductive system. So it excretes gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then gets sent to pituitary, which then releases follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. So highly involved in regulating the menstrual cycle. So when we are suppressing our hypothalamus through underfueling, not eating enough of different varied food groups, maybe stress from exercise, which increases cortisol and other stress-related hormones, psychological stress, all of those can play a role in suppressing the hypothalamus. So if you take any one of them to an extreme, like if you have an eating disorder, for example, and you're severely underfueling, that can be enough to shut down your hypothalamus. If you have an extremely stressful life event, that can be enough to shut down your hypothalamus. It's a temporary thing in that case. And then exercise. Exercise is a little bit more challenging, but it definitely increases cortisol. And so I'm not sure that I can come up with a case where exercise alone suppresses the hypothalamus, but it certainly works it synergizes with underfueling. So there was a really interesting study that's been done in monkeys where the researchers took groups of monkeys. They subjected some of them only to sort of mental stress, which was moving to a different cage. Some of them they subjected to exercise and underfueling, and then some they subjected to both conditions. So the monkeys that were either mentally stressed or underfueling and exercising, about 20% of them lost their menstrual cycles. When you combine the two, it was up to about 80%.
Wow.
So that just kind of illustrates the synergy between the underfueling and then the exercise component.
Right.
So that's sort of those are sort of the major underlying factors. I was actually really interested. So as part of my book, I did a survey of over 300 women that had experienced hypothalamic amenorrhea to kind of understand a whole bunch about the condition. What's the range of eating, exercise habits, range of body sizes, just that women can have when they've experienced HA. So one of the questions that I asked was, have you ever lost weight in the past? And I was actually really surprised to find that 82% of my respondents had lost at least 10 pounds. And this is no matter what their starting weight. Some women started at a larger weight, some women started at a lower weight, but 82% of them had lost 10 pounds or more. And so I think that that's kind of indicative of an ongoing energy deficit to keep your body at a smaller size than maybe it naturally wants to be. And so that can, that previous weight loss, even if it was a few years in the past, if you've maintained your body at that lower weight, that can sort of also predispose you perhaps to having, to having HA.
Right. I mean, that goes back to, like, I've talked about this on previous podcasts about the possibility that when we are underfueled and we stay underfueled, our bodies are really smart and they know that we're not going to have enough to build a human, right? So, and it takes a lot of energy. And so it makes sense that you would not want to have a period happening if you are consistently underfueled. So
yes.
You have a sudden drop in energy intake, and then it stays the same. Your body's like, okay, well, apparently this is where we're going to be for a while, but it's not really sufficient. So we're just going to maintain and it'll be okay because we'll survive until we get more fuel, and then we can think about reproducing, which,
Yes.
is the goal biologically.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's really, it's a survival mechanism because our bodies only have whatever amount of energy that we provide them to use to do everything that they need to do. So there are all the basic functions. There's breathing, there's pumping the blood around our body, there's fueling our brain, which I think takes something like 30% of our calories. There's energy to digest the food we're eating. So even if you're lying down in bed all day and doing nothing, you're probably burning about 1,200 to 1,400 calories, which is what some of these ridiculous diets tell us to eat. So that's barely fueling you for just lying in bed. And then we're not just lying in bed all day. We're up, we're cooking, we're cleaning, we're going to the bathroom, we're going to work, we're walking. I mean, like, we're moving constantly throughout the day. So that's more energy that our body is expending. And then planned exercise, like that's not, our muscles are moving. And so we have to spend that energy. So it's only whatever is left over after all those things are taken care of that our body can even think about putting energy towards the reproductive system. So, and, when women are continually underfueling, they do tend to be cold all the time because the body saves energy by not keeping you warm. You might have brittle hair and nails because the body doesn't want to expend energy on those, superfluous, superfluous items. I mean, there's so much that our body can do to conserve energy. That's not really actually very healthy for us and doesn't set us up for, being well fueled, through our lives.
Exactly. Yeah. And doing that for a short period of time, if necessary, is, our bodies are like, yeah, we can do that. That's fine. But then it's the long-term underfueling that's so challenging. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And unfortunately, our society thinks that's normal.
Yes.
You said like the expectation is that, women especially, but a lot of men too or other people are eating, 1,200-1,500 calories a day. And on your website, you had mentioned the Minnesota semi-starvation study, and they were eating about a little over 1,500 calories a day, and that was considered semi-starvation.
Yes.
And I always think about that because I'm like, wow, I know people who eat that every day, and they still go out and do all the stuff that they do every day.
One other thing to mention that's commonly associated or can be associated with this sort of continual underfueling, and particularly when it leads to amenorrhea, is loss of bone density. And that's something that is really, really important to think about because amenorrhea happens generally in women who are on the younger side, teens, 20s, 30s. But that's when we're supposed to be building our bone for the rest of our lives. And so I think it's really important both for women and their physicians to understand that this is a serious, serious consequence of underfueling and amenorrhea in particular. There are estrogen and progesterone receptors, and estrogen and progesterone are both involved in building up our bones. And so when you have HA, your hormones are sort of at a baseline state all the time. In a normal menstrual cycle, as you get towards ovulation, your estrogen rises quite significantly. And that is the estrogen that really supports our bones. It's not the baseline level. And then same thing with progesterone. Progesterone is low up until after you've ovulated. Then it spikes quite significantly. So that progesterone is what supports our bone growth. And so if we're not having that, if we're not having those two hormones and probably the multitude of other hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle, there are over 20 different hormones that are involved. So often doctors will say, here, take the birth control pill because you're not getting your period, it'll protect your bones. But this is synthetic estrogen and synthetic progesterone, and to promote the idea that this is going to do exactly the same thing as our natural hormones, and so don't even bother thinking about getting your own menstrual cycles back, I think is just really doing a disservice to the women that are needing help. So there's studies show that birth control pills can maintain bone density, but it's typically not increasing as it would in somebody who is cycling naturally.
That's really important to know.
Yeah, so I think that's, and just for women who are going through amenorrhea and their physicians to really think about the consequence of osteoporosis and what that means for your life when you're older. My co-author Lisa's mom has osteoporosis, and she's broken her foot just stepping off a curb. She's broken her wrist by just leaning over on a chair. She's broken her tailbone multiple times. This is really serious, and I think that just pushing it aside and not talking about these consequences and throwing birth control pills at people without addressing the underlying cause of why they are missing their period, I think is really doing a disservice.
Outside of HA, we start so many people on birth control so young, and then what are the future consequences of that?
There are a couple of studies in younger women. I have links to them I have a post about birth control pills on my blog, and I have links to these studies if anybody is interested in looking at them for themselves. There's one where they looked at teenage girls either on the pill or off the pill and what their bone density increase was in a year. Those on the pill had a bone density increase of about 2%, and those not on the pill had a bone density increase of 12%. So
huge.
And this is not women that are experiencing amenorrhea. This is just, your average teenager who's on birth control. So I think it's really important to sort of look critically at the value of being on birth control versus the possible negatives. There are quite a number of books that have come out recently about some of the downsides of the pill. So I would really encourage any physicians who are listening to sort of look into it a little bit more and make sure that this is something that is really the fit for your patients.
Agreed. I know that when I have patients who come in who are on oral birth control, or they're on the Mirena, the IUD, it's kind of frustrating to me sometimes because I don't have any idea of what their reproductive cycle is doing, what their hormones are really doing, because they're being artificially changed. And so, so sometimes, we're trying to figure out something that if they had a normal period, or they had the opportunity to have a normal period, then that would give us so much information.
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, but I'm on the Mirena, so I never bleed, or I take continuous birth control, so I don't really bleed. And so then I look at it because, obviously they're on these things so that they don't get pregnant, which is important as well.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that definitely has to be part of the equation.
Exactly. And so I don't necessarily want to just pull people off birth control, of course, but then also that I feel like I'm blind when I'm looking at them diagnostically, overall, because I'm like, I don't know. And especially when I have people who come in who have eating disorders and also have uteruses, if they are not on birth control, it's, if they are experiencing HA, then it's that gives us a lot more information about their intake.
Yes.
Their food intake, and, are they accurately telling us what, are they accurately telling us what they...
And even if they are being accurate in what they're telling you, it tells you that they're still not eating enough.
Exactly. Or it hasn't been long enough, right? They haven't been eating enough for long enough.
Yes.
So, that can be such a big help in the eating disorder world. But then if they're on birth control, you don't know. Are they getting enough, or is it the birth control that's just not giving them a period?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a complicated.
It's really complicated. I mean, I think it has to be a very individual conversation between a woman, her doctor, maybe her parents, depending on her age. But I do think it's important to really understand some of the downsides of the birth control pill, and not just use it as a panacea for everything, because it does not actually fix anything. It's a Band-Aid. It makes you bleed, yes. It does protect your bones to some degree, but if you're continuing to lose weight and you're on the birth control pill, you're going to lose bone density. So it's not a magic pill. And I've worked with quite a number of women who have regained their cycles and then gone on to gain bone density, even in their 20s and 30s.
I kind of want to segue from this a little bit, because we're talking about the fertility a little bit when we're talking birth control or lack of fertility, and talk about PCOS versus hypothalamic amenorrhea. And because especially if you have somebody, it's very often assumed if you have somebody in a lower weight and they don't have their period, that it is probably because of HA. I would imagine most people are going to catch that pretty quickly, as opposed to somebody at a higher weight if they have HA. And then sort of the opposite when it comes to PCOS. So if you have somebody who's a lower weight and they have PCOS, they're not really getting their periods, and they might be assumed to have HA, but they have PCOS. And then somebody at a higher weight who has HA, is assumed to have PCOS.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
even with PCOS, it can look so different. So there are certain things, that like you can have insulin resistant PCOS, or you can have PCOS that doesn't have any insulin resistance. And then, of course, people who have, the excess follicles, and then some people who don't have excess follicles. Like there's so many different even versions of how PCOS can look, and then it can look probably very similar to HA.
Yes.
So
Yes,
could you go into
absolutely.
that a little bit?
So, I mean, I think one really key point, just to state up front, is that weight is not a diagnostic criterion for either hypothalamic amenorrhea or PCOS. Like,
Or
it's
anything
not
else.
in the Rotterdam criteria. It's not in the NIH criteria. It's nowhere in the literature about hypothalamic amenorrhea. There is nothing that says you can look at somebody and distinguish what their reproductive issue is. So I would really like to get that out there, because I honestly, I work with women now to recover their periods, and so many times a woman will say to me, my doctor said it's not HA because my BMI is quote unquote normal, or my BMI is quote unquote on the larger end of the spectrum, and so therefore it's not HA, it must be something else. It's like, no, weight is not a diagnostic criterion for any of these conditions. So let's just take that off the table and actually look at the underlying things that we can find out. So blood work, look at FSH, LH, AMH, sex hormone binding globulin, prolactin, 17-hydroxyprogesterone, free testosterone, androstenedione, DHEAS. Look at all of those and get a picture of what the woman's hormonal situation is like. That tells you so much more than looking at her and looking at her body and making a diagnosis based on that. So in terms of HA versus PCOS, there are three criteria for PCOS. One is amenorrhea or oligomenorrhea, so a missing period, or periods that are very irregular, 35 plus days apart. So a woman with HA obviously fits that criterion, because she has, that's not a useful tool for diagnosing between HA and PCOS. The second one is polycystic ovaries on ultrasound. So the researchers in this area have found that about 30% of women have what are called multicystic ovaries. So this is ovaries that have a large number of follicles, but not necessarily rising to the level that one would see with polycystic ovarian syndrome. So the criterion that have been developed are that in order to classify an ovary as polycystic, it should have more than 25 follicles on a single ovary, or an ovarian volume of greater than 10 cubic centimeters, or 10 millimeters, depending on milliliters, sorry, depending on which units you want to use. So many women with HA do have multicystic ovaries, but there are not enough follicles or antral follicles, cysts, whatever you want to call them, to get to that level of leading to a PCOS diagnosis. So often, again, women will have an ultrasound, the ultrasound tech or doctor will see, oh, there's lots of follicles, so it must be PCOS. It's like, no, please count them, measure the ovarian volume, and then also look at the blood work picture, because again, simply having multicystic or polycystic ovaries is not sufficient for a diagnosis of PCOS. And with the amenorrhea, again, not distinguishing between the two. So what it really comes down to, in my opinion, is the blood work. Women with HA will tend to have low levels of the reproductive hormones. So very often it's low levels of luteinizing hormone, LH. This is often on the order of less than 1, 1, 2, 3, something like that, where normal is sort of 6 to 7 or above. FSH can sometimes be decreased as well. I've seen it as low as 1, sometimes it's 3 or 4. Sometimes that's more normal. That tends to be sort of more normal more often. So I think that in somebody that has a lower FSH, that indicates perhaps even a higher degree of hypothalamic suppression. Estradiol will tend to be low. Progesterone is often measured. It's really useless except for distinguishing between ovulation and not ovulation. Certainly, it's not part of the diagnostic criteria. So those are sort of the key hormones that I look at for somebody with HA. So LH is probably low, could be normal. It's normal in about 20% of cases. FSH Probably normal, could be a little bit on the low side. Estradiol, probably a little bit on the low side, but also not, that's another one that's not particularly diagnostic. Some other hormones that can be involved, sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG, often quite high in women with HA. And this can be a distinguishing characteristic from PCOS, because in women with PCOS, that is a hormone that tends to be low, which leads to a higher level of free testosterone, which is part of the problem in PCOS. AMH is another one that's an interesting hormone to look at. The sort of common wisdom is high AMH equals PCOS, but again, I find that women with HA often also have high AMH, so that is also not something that is appropriate to use for distinguishing between HA and PCOS.
Yeah, and I've been finding, I have a very small sample size with my patients, but I've been finding I have patients who have pretty much all the other, they're symptomatic of PCOS, but their AMH is, middle to low. It's not necessarily high. So that has been something that I've just been kind of tracking. It's finding interesting. I'm not a researcher, so obviously I don't have a huge sample size, but that's been interesting too.
I mean, I would say that with women with HA, I also haven't done, this is not something that I collected in my survey, because it really has been, it's something that's gotten more attention more recently, but I have seen women with HA with quite low AMH, and I've seen women with HA with quite high AMH. So it, that really runs the spectrum. And it doesn't, in this case, it doesn't seem to be too tied to fertility. So I actually have a little section in my book about women that were told that they had diminished ovarian reserve based on their AMH being low. And there's an interesting study that finds that AMH is actually quite highly correlated with LH. So in somebody with low LH, you might also expect low AMH, and that does change over time. So I think before anybody makes any kind of diagnosis based on AMH, we need a lot more information on that hormone.
I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. And then in terms of somebody with PCOS, that looks quite different from HA hormonally. There can be higher LH, a ratio of 2 or 3 to 1 over FSH. Estradiol tends to be on the higher side, sort of, in the 50 to 100 picograms per mil range, versus HA, where it's often less than 30, less than 20. And then the androgens tend to be elevated in women with PCOS. So high free testosterone, high total testosterone, higher androstenedione, higher DHEAS. So if somebody comes in and they're not getting their period and they do not have elevated androgens, then, and they do have normal or low other reproductive hormones, then it's quite likely that HA is the correct diagnosis. I would also obviously talk to the woman about her eating habits and her exercise habits and weight loss in the past. Absolute weight doesn't matter, but weight loss can be indicative of underfueling that can lead to HA. So that's sort of my grand view of HA versus PCOS.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And then it just occurred to me that somebody could have started out with PCOS, but developed HA, so even once they start having their periods, once they, are sufficiently fueling themselves and actually have the hypothalamus is actually functioning again, then they might still have issues with period, and then you'd have to actually kind of start.
Yes.
Yes. So something to think about as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially when you have somebody who's in a large body who then is like, oh, I have to get into a smaller body to, fix my PCOS, because that's very often what people are told. And so then that could potentially lead to HA.
Absolutely. It absolutely does.
If you're a practitioner to really consider that when you're telling people to lose weight when they have PCOS. And there are a lot of other ways to manage PCOS, even outside of birth control, outside of just medications, that can really help with PCOS and would not ultimately lead to HA.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I have definitely seen that in my experience as well. You know, somebody in the larger body who has or is told she has PCOS and then loses a bunch of weight because that's what you're supposed to do, quote unquote, and ends up, you know, still not getting periods because she now has HA.
Right. Which is so ironic because usually
Yes.
they're trying to lose weight so that they can get periods,
Yes.
so that they can be fertile and have a baby, and yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
then they end up not being able to have. Oh, well.
Yes. So one other point is that I have seen not a few instances where as someone recovers from HA, her LH will go higher than her FSH up to like 14 or 15. And there's also a paper that was recently written on this, which again, I have a blog post about, so I will share that information with you so you can share it with your listeners as well. That sometimes in recovery from HA, it can, you know, some of the hormones can end up looking a little bit PCOS-like. So it's important to kind of give your body some time to really settle into the new hormonal pattern before, you know, before putting another label on, you know, on a person. So, you know, if she's had PCOS as a teenager, for example, and then gone into HA and then looks PCOS like coming back out of it, then probably yes, it is PCOS. But if it's somebody that's never exhibited signs of PCOS, has HA, and then maybe has some blood work that looks a little bit PCOS like as she's recovering, I would just give that some time before saying yes, it is PCOS, and these are the things you should do about it.
Great.
So, yeah,
that's really helpful. I feel like actually we've kind of covered all the things that I was particularly interested in covering just over the course of what we were talking about, and most of it came out, which is great. Are there other things that you want to make sure that people know about, or just like stuff that maybe people don't think about very often, physicians don't think about, that you want to make sure they know about?
Yes, there are a couple of different things that I would like to chat about some more. One thing that I do want to talk about is the idea that's sort of out there in the community that either using progesterone or a combination of estrogen and progesterone will quote unquote jumpstart menstrual cycles. I'm not really sure where that comes from. I've only been able to find one research study that's even a little bit applicable, and in that one, women they found that women, as they came off the birth control pill, would have sort of a sharp increase in FSH and LH. And that's because the birth control pills actually suppress those two hormones quite a lot. So it kind of makes sense that when you stop the birth control pills, that you might see a sharp increase as, you know, it releases those hormones or whatever the mechanism is. But I just want to be clear that it is extremely unlikely that that is going to jumpstart anything in a woman who is continuing to underfuel and exercise and, you know, have a lot of stress in her life. It doesn't really make biological sense because estrogen and progesterone are not the driving hormones behind our menstrual cycle. So just supplying hormones that are kind of somewhere along the pathway downstream of what actually starts our menstrual cycle doesn't really make sense. So the menstrual cycle really starts with the hypothalamus. And so there are some medications that can jumpstart cycles. These are Clomid and Femara. The way that they work is by making the brain sense a slightly lower level of estrogen, and that slightly lower level, our hypothalamus is very sensitive to, and so it senses that lower level and then does increase the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which leads to an increase in follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates a follicle to start growing. So mechanism all over it. So, you know, again, it doesn't work in somebody whose hypothalamus is still suppressed through the underfueling, the exercise, the stress. But in a woman who has been working towards recovery and is eating a sufficient amount, you know, has cut out high intensity exercise and, you know, tried to reduce stress as much as possible, those medications absolutely can work to not only cause one ovulation, but you know, to actually jumpstart normal menstrual cycles. So there was a paper that came out in 2007 by Borges et al., where they did 3 rounds of Clomid. It was a very small study, only 8 women. So, you know, take that for what it's worth. But, you know, so they did 3 rounds of Clomid 3 ovulatory cycles, the women went off and continued to have normal menstrual cycles afterwards. And I have certainly used that and, work when I'm working with women, and I've seen it work on multiple occasions, many more than 8. So, in my experience, that's something that can absolutely be used to truly jumpstart cycles, as long as, again, somebody has worked to reverse sort of the underlying causes of the HA. It's, it's highly unlikely to work in somebody who's still, underfueling.
Right.
And
so I get probably the next thing we can talk about, just, and maybe this is something you were going to bring up anyway, but like working with women and asking the right questions to find out how much how much energy they're actually bringing in, and then how much energy they're actually expending, because certainly I know a lot of folks out there, including physicians and medical professionals, think that a lot of the times the things that are actually causing energy deficiency are the healthy things to do. So like, if you're eating tons of fruits and vegetables, that's fabulous. I mean, nutrient wise, that there's a lot of nutrients in there, but very often if that's the bulk of what somebody's eating, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but it doesn't always give us enough calories. And that's, that basic energy, I think, is something that people forget about. We're so focused on the nutrition of things and like the micronutrients that we forget that actually those bulk macronutrients and the calories in and of themselves are actually things that our body needs.
Yes.
And that our body responds to. So certainly our body responds to when we don't get enough of a micronutrient, but can also seem to manage those things a little better, as opposed to if our bodies aren't getting sufficient energy. So how do you work with women, or how can a practitioner work with women? I guess I shouldn't say just women, but people with uteruses who want to be able to potentially have babies, or at the very least have hormone cycles that will keep them healthy, even if they don't necessarily want to have babies, because it's not always about fertility, of course.
Right.
But how do you go about working with them in such a way that you're not basically saying like, stop exercising and eat a bunch of stuff? Because I'm sure that's what a lot of people will hear, right?
Yes.
You need to sit around and eat everything that you can eat and never move again, which of course is not what.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I will put in a plug for my book here. I've been told that it does a really good job of helping women to understand what's going on and why it's important to make these changes, and supporting them through making the changes. So it's, I think it's very easy for anybody to say, eat more, exercise less, but in practice, it's actually really hard to do, because you have to turn upside down basically everything that you've been taught for probably decades in terms of what's healthy and what's not healthy. Right. So it's way easier to say than it is to actually put into practice. And so women do need a lot of support. And so the book is not just about the science, it also has a lot of support for women in terms of, ideas for making these changes. And it includes a lot of anecdotes from other women that have gone through it, which I think is also really helpful, because one thing to hear from your physician or your dietitian or your naturopath, you need to eat more, but it's kind of like, well,
what does that mean?
How do I know this is going to work? And so I think having the support and the anecdotes from other women and all the data that I have, I think is really helpful. So please go check out the book and the reviews, and you'll see that I'm not just self-promoting here. So that said, I think one of the things that I talk about in the book is that for sort of for women of about average height, 5'6", the daily caloric requirements are about 2,500, which is way more than we've been told. Sort of you read everywhere 2,000 calories a day, and then you're probably cutting that down to diet. So that's based. The 2,000 calories a day is based on self-reports, surveys, and people will often not necessarily accurately describe all of the food that they're eating in a day. So there have been a couple of research groups that have done much more accurate counting of how much energy people are consuming and burning. two different methods, doubly labeled water, where they basically give you water to drink that has, I think it's a radioactive oxygen and a radioactive hydrogen, and then they measure the output or something like that. This is way beyond my pay grade. But, the resulting equations suggest that for a woman who is active, about 2,500 calories a day is a reasonable, is how much they're consuming and burning. So somebody who is actually appropriately fueling. Another group has done studies where they use room calorimeters. So it's basically just another way of measuring how much energy is given off during a day. In a person with a stable weight, again, a female stable weight about 5'6", again, it's about 2,500 calories a day. There's 45 calories per kilogram of lean body mass. I mean, there's, all sorts of equations that you can use, but it comes down to, we've been told for a long time that we need probably a lot less energy than we actually need. And so the 2,500 calories is a good place for people to aim for. And, there's some nuances. So, again, that's all in the book. You can go read about the pluses and minuses. So that's just a piece of knowledge that's not really available to people. And so for women that do not have specifically disordered eating or, thoughts around eating, just giving them that knowledge can make a big difference. It's like, oh, I actually need a lot more than I thought I did, so let me go and do that. For somebody who has, who has an eating disorder, way more challenges around sort of thinking kind of number, and definitely need a lot more support.
Yeah, I was going to mention that in a minute, to just say that if somebody has an eating disorder, that they definitely need to be. This is not necessarily for them as
yes.
It's like
yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that there needs to be a lot more, psychological help and, really a treatment team that's in place for somebody that has an eating disorder.
Yeah. So but, then
yes.
hand in the book and tell them to go eat, because that's not going to be sufficient.
Right. Yes. And I think you can get a pretty good sense of that just from talking to somebody. You can tell how comfortable they feel with the idea of incorporating more calories or cutting down on high intensity exercise, and recommending additional people to kind of bring onto the treatment team.
Yeah, I'm wondering now too, because it is likely that people are going to gain weight when they start eating sufficient calories and not expending as many, because they're no longer in an energy deficit. Have you talked to people about how they've dealt with that weight gain? And particularly for people, I mean, if you're still like kind of in the normal, quote unquote, BMI, the quote unquote normal, then you're going to run into less problems probably with your doctors, and because nobody's going to really, like, they might go, oh, you gained some weight, but that's fine. But particularly people who are in the higher BMI categories, BMI is so problematic, but they might get pushback from their doctors and from their friends and from their family and from themselves.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's.
But even at lower weights, I mean, still you might get that pushback because people will start freaking out.
Yeah, this is such a challenging topic, and one that I really am probably not qualified to cover. But there's so much hatred in our society for people that are in larger bodies that is unwarranted, and I think a lot of science that has sort of been developed, or research that has been done with that as an underlying assumption, that makes it really hard to separate what is actually true in terms of the effect of body size on health and what is not true. So I think, we just have this overall stigma. And then there's all the health-related research that kind of plays into that. And so there's this huge fear of weight gain in just about everybody. And I think, I've learned so much from reading books like Health at Every Size and Body Respect and Body Kindness. And, I don't know everything. This is not my field. But, I looked at, there were some studies that came out about cancer and how it was associated with body size. And I read the paper on lung cancer. No, sorry, it was liver cancer. And the paper itself said, well, there are these underlying conditions that can that can be associated, and they, perhaps they are slightly more common in those in larger bodies, but somebody in a smaller body that has whatever that liver disease is just as likely to get cancer. So let's stop talking about it in terms of body size and talk about those underlying conditions.
Right.
And so I think there's just the whole idea of an association between weight and health. I think we just need to put the kibosh on that as much as we can and talk about, the things that are actually underlying that and, actual health parameters. Weight is not a health parameter.
The whole point of this podcast. Right? Like, parameter.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's so much more important to have a body that is functioning well and a hormonal system that is functioning well. And if that takes gaining some weight, then so be it. I mean, it's, I would argue that somebody with her menstrual cycle in a larger body is probably healthier than that same person without her menstrual cycle in a smaller body. I mean, because of all the valuable things that our menstrual hormones do. I mean, you look at the sort of decline in health that happens when a woman goes through menopause. There's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of neurodegeneration, obviously osteoporosis. Mm-hmm. So our menstrual hormones are protecting us from all of that. And if it takes being in a larger body to have that, then sign me right up, please. And in fact, I did sign myself up for that because I regained all the weight that I had lost and then some that when I was recovering from HA. And you know what? It got me 3 beautiful children and a body that, I just live in this body. I don't, I'm not nearly as critical of myself as I used to be. And I've really appreciated sort of that part of this journey, learning to, not focus on weight in myself or anybody else.
That's fantastic. Accepting your body, but noting that sometimes actually gaining weight or being healthier might look very different than mm-hmm. what you expect it to look like or what society expects it to look like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Healthy is not necessarily having a 6-pack or that's, in fact, in many of us that is not healthy. So.
Exactly. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to make sure you got in.
No, I think we've covered everything, my major points. So.
Excellent. Well, I will of course gather all your information and put it in the show notes. But do you want to go ahead and just do a quick where we can find you?
Absolutely. So my website is www.noperiodnowwhat.com. I'm on Instagram at noperiodnowwhat. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook support group. In fact, I have multiple Facebook support groups. The general one is at noperiod.info/support, and that's for anybody to join who is experiencing hypothalamic amenorrhea. I'm also happy to have any medical professionals who would like to join. I think that it can be really useful to see some of the thought patterns that are happening in women that are experiencing amenorrhea. I have a Getting Pregnant specifically support group. I have a Life After Recovery support group. I have a miscarriage group. So, the general support group is a great place to start. And then links to all of the other ones are available from there.
Fantastic. Well, I am so glad that we were able to pull this together, and I'm so glad that you came on. Thank you very much.
I so appreciate your having me, and I hope that your audience found this useful as well.
I'm sure they did. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. The theme music was composed and performed by Galen Davis. Cover art was designed by Stacy Bias. Administrative support was provided by Paige Carlson. If you enjoyed the podcast or learned something new, please subscribe as it helps amplify this important message. Also, please share with friends and colleagues.